Thank you, Bilal, for this very, very generous introduction. I'm really very happy to be here, and I want to thank you again for inviting me to share my work with the people, whoever is interested, at OSU. The ruptures that are consigned to the rise of Islam have been represented in Islamic historiography as having been fundamental. Muhammad's mission was to usher in a radical departure from the religious and social mores of pre-Islamic Arabia. Pre-Islamic Arabia versus Islam, this is the dichotomy which I am talking about. A sweeping transformation of society was required. Muslims therefore erected boundaries between the acceptable and the reprehensible, between an old order and a new order, and mobilizing in the course of this enterprise the concept of jahiliyya, to create distance from certain types of non-Islamic practices and behavior, notably death rituals. With the rise of the new Islamic order, ritual mourning, in particular the act of lamenting, niyaha, entered into crisis. The Muslims rejected ritual mourning because it was grounded in an ideology of death which was incompatible with the new faith's emphasis on salvation in the afterlife. Moreover, establishing a new social order brought with it deliberate restrictions which fostered the interests of the emerging state and public unity over those of family and tribe. This entailed the reshaping of women's roles in death rituals. The two concerns which weighed on the minds of traditionalists and jurisprudence were the ideal ritual order and the role of women in society. The wailing of women was offensive in their eyes because it represents an act of complaining against God's judgment and of rebelling against God's decree and wisdom. The struggle over wailing, thus, was a conflict between two distinct modes of religiosity. The Jahili mode, characterized by spontaneous, emotional, and violent rituals, and the Islamic mode, characterized by conformity to dogmatic beliefs and by emphasis on routinization. The leading and almost exclusive role women played in keening, lamenting, niyaha, made mourning an explicitly female ceremony. It is thus understandable why the campaign to reform mourning practices in the new Islamic order would have a gender dimension. In hadith literature, hadith these are compilations that include reports of the Prophet's words and actions, hadith literature. In hadith literature, this behavior was exemplified as one of the hallmarks of idolatrous behavior associated with the jahiliyya, this pre-Islamic time, from jahl, from ignorance, from the time of ignorance, or time prior to the mission of Muhammad and the new religion. It's a difficult concept, jahiliyya. It's slippery. Women's roles in death rituals were pivotal in providing new formative guidelines which were to be contrasted with these jahili pre-Islamic practices. But in this case, another dimension is added, namely the tenacity of women's behavior, which will ensure the survival of jahili mourning behavior, particularly in the guise of female lamentation, that is niyaha. Death is not an end, but a step in a larger scheme and a necessary passage into the afterlife. Thus, the pious Muslim has nothing to fear. He has nothing to fear from death. Without wishing for it, it is his or her duty to accept death with serenity as a prelude to a new life and carry hope for those who have died. It was only natural, in line with these new religious conceptions, for Islam to modify certain funerary practices, in particular sacrifices and lamentations. In the new order, traditional acts of mourning, such as crying out loudly, throwing dust on one's hand, and the tearing of one's hair, were abhorred. Strong emotional reaction to death was condemned from the religious point of view, because it implied a skeptical attitude towards the divine promise of eternal life, as I've just said, and almost it implied a preference for earthly values. If the former flamboyant expression of excessive grief was no longer considered appropriate, then a new psychology, that of sabr, of steadfastness maybe, a new psychology of sabr and contentment with the divine decree was offered in its place. So lamenting niyaha is repeatedly condemned by the Islamic tradition in hadith in particular. Compilations of hadith include traditions admonishing crying over the dead and extravagant shows of grief. Niyaha, as an established institution of jahiliyya, was considered to be a legacy of paganism. As such, it was condemned by the Prophet, who explicitly said in one of the traditions in the Sahih, 4 Islamic jahili customs will be retained by my community. Now I'm quoting the Prophet. 4 pre-Islamic jahili customs will be retained by my community. They are boasting of the family's achievement, ahsab, attacking genealogies, invoking the planets in order to receive rain, and lamenting the dead, and niyaha, unquote. The Prophet is said, however, to have made a distinction between lamenting and weeping, niyaha and buka. Grief and sorrow for the loss of a relative can be expressed as the Prophet himself did when his only son died. Quote, at the death of his son Ibrahim, the Prophet wept, baka. Someone said to him, O Messenger of God, did you not forbid weeping? He said, I forbade nawah, the raising of one's voice in 2 instances. A voice raised in a state of happiness and a voice in times of misfortune, which shows itself in mutilating one's face, tearing of clothes, and their diabolical mourning cry. My personal tears express my compassion, my rahmah. So while consolation was a desirable custom, lamenting the dead was forbidden. The most important collections of prophetic traditions, namely those of Al-Bukhari, of Muslim, of Abu Dawood, Al-Nasa'i, they all have transmitted that the Prophet instructed us, quote, not to bewail over a dead person, unquote. Some traditions prohibit striking the head with the hands and the tearing of clothes when a calamity occurs. One tradition, specifically, prophetic tradition, specifically states that the one who strikes the face, tears the clothes, and summons the cause of jahiliyya does not belong to us. What the tradition, what the hadith seemed to be condemning, was the gesturing and public histrionic manifestations of grief, a theatricality verging on a lack of sincerity. Moreover, the tradition was perhaps meant to discourage actions of lamenting that would increase rather than obliterate the grief of the bereaved person. But most of all, and perhaps I'm repeating myself here, wailing and manifestations of abandonment to grief were deemed to be incompatible with resignation to God's will and submission to His decisions. It is, of course, women who were the main actresses in the dramatic performance surrounding death. According to Al-Mubarrad, in Jahiliyya, if women wished to exaggerate their sadness, they would shave their heads and strike their faces with their sandals. Pre-Islamic poetry functioned as a form of public register, serving both as a method of communication and as a storehouse for collective memory, with poets representing their respective tribal interests. Within the system of pre-Islamic Arab poetry, women were entrusted with lamenting the dead, as well as inciting to war and to blood vengeance, tahrid. Women's role in lamentation during Jahiliyya is epitomized in the person of Al-Khansa, the most famous of all the lamenting poets, and the best-known female poet in the classical Arabic poetic tradition. Upon the death in battle of her 2 brothers, Al-Khansa's poetic potentialities burst. Her hero, her obsession, was her fallen brother, Sakhar. While Al-Khansa lived most of her life in pre-Islamic times, post-conversion stories. That is, Al-Khansa lives in pre-Islamic and Islamic times, and she converts actually to Islam. So post-conversion stories reflect the embarrassment of Al-Khansa's newly converted kinsmen, her family, who as well they all converted. They were embarrassed by her continued mourning, as in reflected, of course, in the poetry towards with respect to her two brothers, Sakhr and another brother. So I repeat that her kinsman felt very embarrassed by her continued mourning, both in the guise of elegies, but also because she continued to wear the pre-Islamic mourning garb. And anecdotes relate that Al-Khansa was approached by Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and she revealed the reason of her deep grief and her continued wearing of this. She revealed it to Aisha, wife of the Prophet, when Aisha asked her about the hair shirt. She used to wear a very coarse hair shirt on her body. So Aisha was asking her about the hair shirt she was wearing. Aisha told her, "What is this, Al-Khansa? The Prophet, may God's mercy be upon him, he died, and I did not wear it for him." Al-Khansa answered by relating the unfailing support that Sakhr had provided her in all moments of distress in his life. 3 times she approached him in dire need, and he gave her half of his wealth. When she came a 4th time, Sakhr's wife tried to persuade her husband Sakhr not to give her anything. But Sakhr rejected this counsel, reciting, this is all Al-Khansa's words, of course, and apparently Sakhr told his wife, "Were death to destroy me, I am sure that she, Al-Khansa, my sister Al-Khansa, she would tear off her headgear and put on a camel hair bodice." And this is all, part of the conversation, that dialogue which was having with Aisha. And these stories substantiate the disapproval in which pre-Islamic mourning institutions were held after the rise of Islam. But at the same time, they emphasize Al-Khansa's strength of will in maintaining her mourning and expression of grief, even in the face of societal disapproval. James Bellamy states that it is hard to believe that Al-Khansa's grief for her brothers was so intense that it could only be purged by 100 poems. But was Al-Khansa's grief a solitary instance, or was it a reflection of the passion that grief could unleash, and of the primitive irrational taking hold? The fashioning of a new society that would deal with the drama of an individual's death in an Islamic way meant that, in contrast to pre-Islamic reactions, forbearance was from now on the correct Islamic response. In the context of the conquest of Khaybar, the seerah, the biography of the Prophet, the seerah of Ibn Hisham, relates the reaction of one woman who, upon seeing her slain fellow, Khaybar was a Jewish tribe, so she was a Jewish woman. So this one woman who, upon seeing her slain fellow tribesman, she shrieked and slapped her face and poured dust on her head. When the Prophet Muhammad saw her, he said, "Take this she-devil from me," because she was mourning. There were thus religious prescriptions prohibiting lamenting, and traditions that explicitly condemned the Na'iha's work, because Niyaha is a profession as well. There were professional mourners who actually would be paid to come in and help, with the mourning rituals and with the lamenting, etc. So there are specific traditions which condemn the women who work as Na'ihas. The Prophet is reported to have said that the deceased would be punished if a professional mourner is hired to keen by the grave. So the whole general gist is that lamenting had to be contained because it inflames grief, and grief in turn arouses passion. Grief arouses passion, as observed in the behavior of Hind bint Utbah, the wife of Abu Sufyan, the mother of Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty. Hind bint Utbah, I repeat, the wife of Abu Sufyan, who was the arch enemy of the Prophet Muhammad. following the Battle of Badr. Following that battle, Hind bint Utbah, well, in the Battle of Badr, she had lost her father, her uncle, her brother. Al-Waqidi relates that Abu Sufyan, upon his return to Mecca after this huge losses that the Qurayshites had sustained at Badr, that Abu Sufyan, upon his return to Mecca, instructed the Quraysh not to cry over their killed ones, nor for a na'iha to lament over them, nor for a poet to eulogize them, lest their anger vanish and they fall prey to the derision of Muhammad and his companions. The idea that they should actually remain angry so that they would be able to perhaps take their revenge. Hind herself reiterates these concerns, stating that she will not cry until she takes revenge. Quote, "If I knew that my sadness would leave my heart, I would cry, but nothing would take it away except seeing my revenge with my own eyes." Not all proved so strong, and Hind herself falls short of her words. The 7th century Kufan poet Ayman bin Huraym recalls scenes of lamentation spurred by these heavy losses. Quote, "The calamity that befell the Banu Harb," this is the family of Abu Sufyan, "left their women dazed. Had you seen Hind and the Ramla crying and beating their cheeks, you would have cried like a mother whose only son was carried off by fate." Indeed, Hind challenged the claim of the grieving poetess Al-Khansa as being the most bereaved of all the Arabs, and declared that she, Hind, of all Arabs, had suffered the greatest of catastrophes. Dwelling on her grief, Hind set out to the fair of Uqad, sought out Al-Khansa, and challenged her claim, whereupon both women composed elegies on their dead. Hind's verses call us to emphasize also Hind's role as a learned poetess in the genre of Marathi elegies, which was in pre-Islamic Arabia, as I said before, reserved for warriors killed in battle. Often composed by women, such elegies immortalize the fallen hero, calling for vengeance as an act of purification to cleanse the tribe of disgrace and revitalize its skin by shedding enemy blood. According to Suzanne Sitkevich, women of the warrior class were allowed or even required to have a public voice on restricted occasions, namely niyaha, lament for their adult menfolk, and tahrir, inciting their menfolk to battle. Hind was thus performing a quintessential role as a free woman in the pre-Islamic context. Hind's lamentation and call for vengeance prolonged and exacerbated tensions. Such behavior threatened the temporary chaos of death and mourning to spill over into society at large and threaten its stability. Hind used lamentation to keep alive her family's cause and to stir up the desire for revenge. Mourning women are indeed dangerous, especially since the themes developed by women who lament were at odds with the rhetoric of the public ideology of the emerging Muslim community, of the emerging Ummah. The Jahili women's behavior symbolized the forces of kin, nature, and passion, while the Islamic discourse and rituals surrounding death suppressed personal feeling. Women's lamentations were thus deemed to be a demonstration that death has temporarily overwhelmed self-control and faith in God. Passionate lamenting was dangerous all the more since it was inseparable from its status as a principally women's genre, and women are represented as emotional and irrational, always requiring male control. Linking lament too closely with emotion might obscure its character as an often politically charged act. Laments were not only performances of grief, but also of grievance, moving some to violent revenge on behalf of the bereaved. In the ancient city of Athens, Solon blamed the emotional excesses of women's laments for causing barbaric blood feuds. The excessive mourning of Electra, Antigone, and Medea obscured their judgments and threw them into the realm of madness and death. In a similar fashion, perhaps, Hind mingled grief with rage and hatred to such an extent that it could only be quenched by an act of irrational violence. And like Shakespeare's Queen Margaret, who demanded recognition of the seniority of her suffering, saying, inflation, sorrow, be most reverent, give mine the benefit of seniority. Hind challenged the claim of the lamenter without peer, the grieving poetess Al-Khansa, of being the most grieved of all the Arabs, declaring herself to be the greatest of all the Arabs in terms of catastrophe suffering. This was not simply a listing of catastrophes, but rather a deliberate inflammation of hatred. Queen Margaret said, "Bear with me, I am hungry for revenge. Cancel his bond of life, dear God. I pray that I may live to say the dog is dead." In much the same way that Hind cursed and raged, giving vocal expression to her pain. She waits until the next battle at Uhud to avenge father, son, and uncle. The passion of her grief is such that it potentially threatens the new order. Hind's excessive call for revenge and her outrageous irrational acts stand in the text in direct opposition to the accepting and quietist attitude with which Muslim women were to react to the death of their male relatives fallen in battle. Lamentation has historically allowed women to organize their expression of grief, to generate anger, to diffuse a sense of helplessness at catastrophic loss, to preserve past memories, and to communicate with the dead. Ritual lamentation provided Al-Khansa and Hind with a public platform from which they could speak and clamour their pain and need for revenge. Their lamentations were disruptive, crying their outrage and articulating their grievance as an unending experience of grief, and in so doing threatening the order of the emerging society. The work of grief and the articulation of grievance go together. The women who grieve at the same time as they protest and contest articulate their rage in uncompromising tones, making reconciliation impossible. So at the Battle of Uhud, the next battle, as I said, the Prophet's uncle Hamza was killed. And there and then, Hind seized the opportunity for retaliation. In a transport of vengeance, Hind and the women with her mutilated the corpses of the fallen Muslims. They strung their cut-off ears and noses into anklets and necklaces. Hind finally ripped out Hamza's liver, biting on it. The Islamic answer to Hind's excessive lamentation after the Battle of Badr is reflected in Safiya's response to the mutilation of her brother Hamza at the Battle of Uhud. The new Islamic ethos that Safiya now represented called for a modification of behavior, a display of restraint and forbearance. When Safiya came to see the corpse of her brother, the Prophet told her son Az-Zubair to take her back, quote, so that she does not see what has happened to her brother. Safiya refused, saying, "Why? I have heard that my brother has been mutilated for God's sake. I will be calm and patient if it's God's will." Safiya eulogized her brother Hamza in verses that confirmed the profound belief of a Muslim woman and her acceptance of God's divine decree. Safiya was mirroring the new paradigm of how the women of the emerging ummah were to confront mortality. Safiya's patient reaction and words at the sight of the corpse of Hamza reflects a withdrawal from the female world of lament, shifting emotions away from the morbid relish of female grief, giving instead the death of the fallen martyrs its full meaning. In this case, it is a woman, a Muslim woman, who translates the new mood, the new ideology, which prohibits lamentation over the dead and promotes an ethic of patience when confronting the tests of time and the decrees of God. Even reactions to the Prophet's own death were to follow Islamic prescriptions. When Ayman, the Prophet's nurse, cried upon hearing of the Prophet's death, she is said to have defended herself by saying, "By God, I do not cry over him, knowing that he has departed to what is better for him than this world. I cry for the termination of revelation." Women's lamentation came to constitute an offense against the new community. While the death of members in the Jahili context may bring disorder, for the Muslims, death of individual members does not threaten the divinely instituted communal bonds of the Ummah, of the new Muslim community. So the loss does not involve any longer only the blood relatives of the fallen, but encompasses the entire community across different tribes and families. Muslim women were to become the medium through which correct grief and emotion for the social whole. In the seerah of Ibn Hisham, the biography of the Prophet, the death of the Prophet is grieved only by the official male poet Hassan ibn Thabit, whose long poem forms the closure to his lengthy biography. There no women are found lamenting. In the Muslim Ummah, women's lament, the female voice, at once stigmatized, ideologically marked, and construed as a problem, is now superseded into the culturally sanctioned male voice of Hassan ibn Thabit. The verses reflect a change from the pre-Islamic style, genre, and method of composition, away from the ideals of pagan tribalism toward the new Islamic ideal defended by an emerging political and religious community. Unlike the pre-Islamic poets who defended his tribe against tribal tribes, the new polarity revealed in the poetry of Hassan is one between believers and their enemies. Islam was not alone in eliminating the role of women in mourning rituals. In ancient Greece, the outlawing of public female mourning by Solon in the 6th century BC had given way in Athens to two new discursive models of mourning, namely the tragedy and the official state funeral oration. A predominantly female oral tradition was rewritten as a set of performance conventions which excluded female performers and female members of the audience. Mourning in Athens was reappropriated in a process that negated the female. It is as if the attempt to impinge on women's ritual authority through suppressing their lamentations was an attempt to silence them. Regulating mourning equaled regulating women. So strongly does the reciprocal relation between women and mourning asserts itself in the ancient Greek texts. Similarly, in the emerging Muslim Ummah, there was a binary and gendered opposition between the official male performed and male attended and the unofficial female lamentation modes of mourning. Death was to leave the private personal domain of the female and enter into the public and political world of the male. Lamenting women who symbolized disorder and jahili ways were to be replaced by institutionalized poets like Hassan ibn Thabit, who was henceforward allotted the task of expressing the community's reaction to a given loss. But such reformed discipline in ritual lament was not easy to follow, since it is through the acts of tending the dead that women carry out that intense work of the soul, that gradual rearrangements of its boundaries which must occur when a loved one is lost. Denying the veracity of certain beliefs, practices, and rituals was not enough to eradicate them. A gap would persist between official theology and popular practice. The new models of behavior would not easily displace the ancient mourning customs. And so, during his lifetime, the Prophet had to constantly teach the proper attitude toward death. During his lifetime, the Prophet was to constantly teach the proper attitude towards death that was compatible with the new belief, and thus to draw the line between the old and new order. For instance, when Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was killed at the Battle of Mu'tah, someone informed the Prophet that the womenfolk of Ja'far were crying. The Prophet twice ordered them to refrain from such behavior, and twice they desisted. Aisha claims that the Prophet said, "Go and fill their mouth with sand." In one version, Ja'far's wife Asma bint Umays relates that upon learning that Ja'far was killed, "I stood up and screamed, and the women came to me. The Prophet began to say, 'O Asma, do not speak obscene words or beat your chest.'" Another version, which projects a more appropriate response on the part of Asma, has the Prophet asking her, "O Asma, will you not rejoice?" She replied, "But of course, for you are dear to me." He said, "Indeed, God Most High has made two wings for Ja'far, that he may fly with them to paradise." She replied, "By my father and my mother, O Messenger of God, inform the people of that." Hadith compilations have included, moreover, specific directives as to the mourning restrictions that Asma was to follow. Asma bint Umayyah said that when Ja'far was killed, the Prophet came to see us and he said, "Stand up, wear the clothes of mourning for 3 days, and then do what you please." The tension persisted, nevertheless, between what the official religion allowed and what would actually be done. Goldziher collected information about the persistence of lamentation practices and among the episodes, I will simply mention some of these episodes. The wife of Al-Hassan, son of Ali ibn Abi Talib, erected a tent over his grave and maintained it for a year. The women of the Mughira clan placed their hair on the grave of the Muslim hero Khalid ibn al-Walid. A poet saw girls beating their faces by the grave of an Abbasid prince in Samarra. This female resistance to the many prophetic injunctions to follow restraint and accept God's decree seems to have continued all the way down to the Mamluk periods. And of course there are many more examples, but I don't have time to bring them all up. Al-Hajj denounced the numerous innovations and un-Islamic manners that he observed in the female customs associated with death rituals, stating that women expose their faces and spread their hair, they blacken both face and body, and lament and wail in loud, shrieking voices. Ibn al-Hajj expounds how a na'iha was hired to intensify the atmosphere of mourning, leading female relatives and friends to the beats of the tambourine, the wailer orchestrating a powerful scene of lamentation. Women indulged in these scenes in defiance of the Sharia, religious law, for several days and nights after the death. This is all Ibn al-Hajj's description. Social and religious inhibitions were little regarded, and the women vent their sorrow and their pain in the most vehement manner. A woman coming to present her condolences would enter while shouting her distress, striking and scratching her face, and the nawa'ih receive her in their usual reprehensible ways. This is all Ibn al-Hajj. The continuance of women lamenters and professional mourners revealed their hesitancy to integrate into their new religious selves and kept them at the border between pagan and Muslim, wild and subdued. The use of professional mourners thus continued in spite of clear condemnation, and Islam came to understand wailing as a common, intractable pagan rite that survived despite religious efforts to abolish it. Well, the evidence that I've really so far depended on comes from mainstream Sunni sources reflecting behavior or ideas, really, within the Sunni community. The Shiites carried lamentation to a far higher level after the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson Al-Hussein in 680 at Karbala, an event that rendered the Shiite religion to be described as a religion of lament. Lamenting the family of the Prophet carried with it was a different kind of connotation and certainly more prestige. Although the Shiite legal books record opposition to violent lament, the tone of some traditions is ambivalent, since wailing for the imams was deemed appropriate. Weeping was to be a reminder of the sufferings of Al-Hussein, whose death serves as the basis for identity. Mourning take a primordial dimension here, and it is significant that here again, lamenting for Al-Hussein was initiated, of course, by a woman, his sister Zainab, who is said to have instituted the majlis, the commemorative assemblies, the mourning and lamentation in the assemblies, as a fundamental ritual. While in the 7th and 8th centuries, Shia lamentation sessions, majalis al-niyaha, were held in private or around the shrines of the imams, the 9th century witnessed the appearance of professional mourners, both men and women, who were involved in mourning the Prophet's family, using their lamentation elegies using in their lamentation elegies that were composed to commemorate Al-Hussein and his family. By the 10th century, Shia men and women were parading the streets of Baghdad in processions mourning Al-Hussein. At-Tanuhi talks about a na'iha in Baghdad, her name is Khil, who lamented Al-Hussein and the family of the Prophet in private house. Traditionalists, members of the most conservative madhab, school of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam. Khil's work posed a threat to her own life, as the head of the Hanabila said, I have heard that Ina'i Hanun as Khil is lamenting, get her and kill her. The attack on lamenting and its professional practitioner, the Na'iha, thus sometimes resulted from such intersectarian tensions. The death of Al-Hussein would continue to serve as a fundamental basis for identity and cohesion for the Shia community, especially so in the continuity of the sorrow, really. Shia lamenting and weeping, which was performed by both women and men, appear in the mainstream texts, Sunni texts, as disproportionate. By extension, it is the entire community which appears as dangerously excessive. Moreover, since mourning and lamenting are primarily female occupations, is a community whose redemptive suffering enjoys and provokes weeping, hence feminized. But in either cases, whether Sunni or Shi'i, it is women who are the main offenders, blurring the boundaries between the old and the new order through their excessive lamenting and emotional indulgence. Emotion, especially when it is passionate, is seen as subversive, destructive, and dangerous. The emerging Islamic community in this period of great historical transition, sort of these are concluding remarks, but it's not a paragraph, so maybe I have 5 more minutes to have it. The emerging Islamic community in this period of great historical transition strove to establish a new order which sought to replace kinship and the power of blood relations with the emergent ethical order based on the principles of the new Ummah. The intense acts of lamentation of Hind and other Jahili women stood in contrast to the controlled, quietist attitude with which the women of the new Muslim order were to follow in reaction to the death of their loved ones, thus highlighting a binary construction of an ideal type of Muslim womanhood against an equally constructed Jahili woman. The Islamization of these rituals implied, first and foremost, the stifling of emotional outbursts, more specifically of lamenting niyaha, that pietists associated with Jahili practice. However close to actual pre-Islamic practice, niyaha became the construct of ideologues striving to define, by opposition, the ideal Islamic ritual. Ritual lament was perhaps the foremost medium in which women expressed themselves and their concerns publicly, and could therefore exert some influence on the community's affairs, posing a subtle challenge to the dominant ideology of the early Muslim Ummah. Seeing the danger and political potential of extreme grief, the emerging Ummah tried to bring funerary behavior under state control, and thus establishing masculine control over death rituals. Male pietists feared that wailing women would upstage the poised and contemplative Muslim man who had already submitted to God's judgment and now yearned to enact and predictable funerary rites. But all of this was an ideal scheme frustrated by the reality of wailing women whose spontaneous poetry and unpredictable behavior epitomized and would continue to epitomize the chaos of pre-Islamic times. Our text saw women's lament as an inferior model of comportment, pagan, womanly, emotional. Grief was to be regulated and controlled, and clear rules were formulated for its performance. Jahiliyya, as a point of origin, became the place that needs to be controlled, a historical moment that is to be put decisively behind. The new order sought to bring women's lament and public displays of grief under control and to adapt them for their purposes. They recognized the threat of leaving this daring resource in the control of women whose ritual behavior had its roots in Jahiliyya custom. The canon of Islamic funerary practices set forth in the fiqh literature, in the legal literature, provides a structure of order and meaning for the bereaved. But to understand Islamic beliefs and practices relating to death, it is necessary to stress that Muslim bereavement practices took shape between what is prescribed and what is performed. The performed dimension of religion is subtler and gives people the freedom to appropriate, contest, adapt, and change religious and cultural norms. Historians of medieval Europe have reflected on the religiousness of certain everyday practices and on the way medieval women turned daily actions into religious proclamations. In this particular case, women's continued involvement in lamentation suggests, even if obliquely, the weakness of their faith. The anthropologist Layla Abu Lughad has concluded that the traditionally gendered rituals where women lament the people they have lost and men instead invoke God will become an important means by which women publicly enact their own moral and ultimately social inferiority. The cultural authority of the women lamenters was overtaken by the civilizing power of the transformation. However, women, some of them at least, the protectors of cultural identity, withstood assimilation and maintained some of the rituals related to death. The women who continued to lament the dead were, in a sense, societal in-betweens, spiritual in-betweens, entering the in-between spaces that initiate new representations of identity and pioneer moments of cooperation and controversy. Thus, while their resistance reflected at the surface a certain passivity, it was latently a boundary-maintaining mechanism against the new male-dominated order. The new instructions regarding behavior created a temporal boundary between the time of jahiliyya and the time of Islam. The construction of Islamness required the invention of Islam as a religion, as an organized body of belief and ritual, severed from earlier cultural practices, notably those that surround death. Women's lamentation will continue to represent, in the age of rapid religious change, a retarding effect of attitudes and rituals from the pre-Islamic past, which remain operative in the Islamic present. The repetition, which is the very nature of rituals, represents, according to Clifford Geertz, an enactment, a materialization, a realization of the worldview encapsulated in myth and symbol, implying continuity with the past. The textual examples give a pivotal role to the figure of the lamenting woman, underscoring the degree to which women play in the shaping and acceptance or opposition of changing religious practice. Whether they were performing jahiliyya or articulating their reformed Islamic selves, through lamenting or abstaining from lament, women were inherent markers of identity and belonging. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. I guess Nadia, you can take the questions yourself.
Thanks for your very clear and thoughtful